In 1396, a peace treaty was signed by both England and France to mark the marriage of England's King Richard II and the daughter of Francis Charles VI, which was intended to bring an end to the series of disputes and ensuing battles that had been going on between the territories for the previous 2 centuries. However, the peace ended after the English Henry V ascended to the throne. With great ambitions and a need to prove his authority to his own people, he decided to renew Old English claims on France. At the time, the latter country was in turmoil, weakened by a mad king and one of France's many periodic political crises, which we spoke about in our episode exploring the origins of the word foment. Henry chose this moment to seize his opportunity for power, arriving on the shores of Normandy in 1415 with about 1,200 soldiers in tow. The men spent 6 weeks laying siege to a port town before finally emerging victorious, but at a great cost. Partly due to combat and illness, partly due to desertion, Henry's army was nearly cut in half, and what remained was weakened by disease. The party made its way toward the English port of Calais in hopes of sailing back to their homeland, but French forces arrived and were able to intercept the army near Agincourt. By many accounts, the English were grossly outnumbered, with conservative estimates suggesting a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of the French, though some suggest it could have been as much as 5-to-1. But either way, the English were at a decided disadvantage. With this information, the French army seemed at ease, relying on their strategy of simply having the larger force. But England didn't have this luxury. The odds were against them, and they would have to be fox clever to make it out of this alive. The night before the battle, Henry sent out a small retinue of knights on a reconnaissance mission to observe the battlefield for any potential advantages or concerns. The land had been freshly plowed, and after heavy rains earlier in the evening, the earth was muddy and challenging to move through. The English made camp at a narrow end of the field that was bracketed by 2 sets of woods. On one side, the Agincourt woods, and the Tramcourt woods on the other. These sets of trees created a kind of topographical funnel over the battlefield, with the French army at the mouth blocking any chance of England's escape. They were trapped. That night, Henry and 2 of his close confidants, Sir Thomas Erpingham and Edward, Duke of York, conspired a battle plan that was 1 part military operation and 1 part hunting expedition. They sharpened tree branches into spears, embedding them into the wet earth at what would be their front line. In the morning, they sent fleets of longbow archers forward into the woods where they could move closer to their enemies and attack without being seen. At the base of this funnel, the English army positioned more archers as well as their melee fighters poised for attack. They stared at the French line, and the French line stared back. For hours, but no one moved. The English waited for their adversaries to charge, but the latter had no reason. It would be just as easy to starve out the invaders and be done with it. Henry knew he had to make the first move. He ordered his banners forward, advancing toward the French army, and on his signal, the unseen archers in the woods began firing into the French line. The English army raised their voices, imitating the sound of a hunting call, as though the French were simply deer being driven towards hunting grounds. The opposing army would not be able to mistake it for anything other than the insult that it was, and so they charged on the English and forged their way straight into a trap. With archers on either side tearing away at their flank and decimating their cavalry, the vanguard quickly began to falter, their heavy armor weighing them down into the thick mud, making them easy targets to be picked off by the bowmen. Though many dropped on the field before even reaching England's position, eventually some fighters managed to make it far enough for hand-to-hand combat to ensue. But the soldiers along the barricades of sharpened tree branches left the French army nowhere to go. The front lines were smothered by battle, wounded soldiers were trampled, the French fighters were so tightly packed that they began to suffocate where they stood. The second wave of French soldiers didn't offer momentum to push forward. They served only to crush their brothers in arms. With the armies both within melee range of each other at this point, the archers positioned near the front line abandoned their bows for combat weapons and surrounded the remaining French soldiers. The third wave of France's army never advanced. The battle had already been won. In the end, England's small army suffered about 100 deaths. France suffered thousands. The latter's tactless battle strategy had been being the bigger army, a good contingency plan but obviously not foolproof. But Henry V was a clever strategist. He had to be. His father was a usurper to the throne. His entire campaign had been a part of his master plan. He had to decisively prove that he was the rightful king of England, and with the Battle of Agincourt, he accomplished that. Yet that kind of intelligence, the skill of strategy, it needs to be honed. Before this battle, Henry hunted. It was a hobby of his that he shared with his cousin and close friend Edward, Duke of York, his co-conspirator for this conflict, who, on this very battlefield, fought and died for his king. Edward may not have made it out alive, but the strategy that he formulated alongside Henry had succeeded, even when it truly seemed impossible. And it isn't conjecture that Edward played an important role in formulating this battle plan. As I mentioned, he was an avid hunter alongside the king. In fact, hunting was of such interest to him that he academicized it by penning Master of Game, the oldest and one of the most important hunting texts in the English language. A great deal of the book was based off of Gaston Phoebus's Livre de Chasse, which York translated from its original French, while of course making sure to throw in his own 2 pence. In the book, York speaks of preferred dog breeds and how to care for and direct them in the hunt, but he also writes at length about different wildlife. He speaks of hare and hart, buck and badger, their natures, their wiles, and how they might react towards you when they realize your aim. But it's his chapter on foxes which interests us the most, because here is where we find the first ever documented use of our word, vixen. York speaks very frankly on the nature of the vixen, noting her relationship to her male counterpart, the fox, breeding habits, burrowing habits, and the species' innate cunning. He notes how they frequently outsmart both men and hounds, and that oftentimes it is easier to bring down a stag than to catch a fox. They are stealthy and clever. If a hunter is to catch one, they wouldn't cry as they were slain, but they would fight with everything they have while they are still alive. He writes about them as if they were vermin. At the time they were considered as such, but they were vermin that York seemed to admire. And it wouldn't be too hard to imagine that he used some of that vulpine ingenuity while plotting the Battle of Agincourt on that rainy night. But speculation aside, we can learn more about the history of vixen in the text's glossary, which included multiple spellings and evolutions of the word, including foxen, fixen with 2 Fs, and fixen with 1 F, which we will take a closer look at later on in the episode. Though York based his book closely on that Livre de Chasse, it is unlikely that we would find a further antiquated form of vixen in the original, as it is etymologically unrelated to the French Reynard, though the 2 words do share an interesting connection. You see, originally, long ago, the French had an entirely different word for fox. Instead of the modern Reynard, they were referred to as goupil, a Vulgate adaptation of the Latin vulpes. It wasn't until the 13th century that goupil was replaced, and, as it turns out, the change was entirely thanks to a series of folk tales which had become immensely popular throughout the continent in the Middle Ages. Reynard the Fox was an important character in European medieval literature, especially in the areas of modern-day northern and western France, Germany, and Belgium, though in actuality the reach of his legends and those of his associates would eventually leave its mark in all corners of the continent and beyond. The tales began as a series of allegorical stories featuring animals who are presented with the roles and personalities of humans. The fables were generally satirical and used as a critique of society and its most prominent figures, such as monks and kings. There is still a bit of debate about the origins of these stories. One theory suggests the fables are owed to the imagination of monks in what is now Germany, and, as a note, I will be speaking of the territories as we would see them on a modern map, as during the period that we are discussing, there was a great deal of border shifting back and forth between East Francia and West Francia, so it can be a bit confusing. We speak about the contention between the two kingdoms in more depth in our episode covering the etymology of the word Carolingian if you are interested in learning more. Either way, there were a number of these monks who were writing down beast sagas throughout the Middle Ages at a prolific rate. They became ubiquitous within the pop culture of the area. In fact, our oldest surviving text featuring a beast epic was originally written by a monk, but interestingly, it references an older beast fable within the story in such a way as to imply that readers of the time would have already been familiar with it, which would indicate that these tales predate our written accounts and calls into question their true origins. Yet we can see the monks' fingerprints in the traditions, settings, and names of some of the characters. Reynard himself seems to owe his name to these monks. Reynard has several forms, but they all allude to the same etymology. It comes from an old High German name, Reynard, and can be broken down into two parts. The first we will examine is Regen or Regen, which means counsel or might, coming from the proto-indo-european root reg, which at its core means to move in a straight line, and we often see it used in words referencing leadership roles and conventions, such as royal regimes whose regents reign over realms. Regenhart's second aspect is the word hard, as in solid or firm, and comes from the proto-Germanic hardu, which derives from the pie car of the same meaning. Together, they form a word indicating that someone is strong in counsel, a steadfast leader, etc. And certainly, Reynard is portrayed as quite clever and capable, knowing how to outsmart others for accolades, food, and even to cheat death. In fact, so clever is our fox that over the years he rose from the ranks of a secondary character to the main attraction, dethroning his friend and adversary, the wolf Isengrim, from the Latin Isengrimus, meaning the one with the iron helmet. Reynard's etymology makes very apparent the influence of German writers on the fables of the fox, but there is another theory of its origins to examine. Jacob Grimm, who published his own edition of Reinhard Fuchs, saw the concept of a beast saga as being prehistoric, originating in the times when men lived lives that were more closely connected with animals and could even see aspects of humans within the animals, and likewise aspects of the animals within humans, imagining animals with human relationships, human concerns, and human vices. Grimm believed that this philosophy resulted in fables like that of Reynard, but also that it branched off into concepts such as the werewolf, though this is just one school of thought. And it also seems worth noting that similar texts exist in a multitude of cultures. There are connections between the stories like that of Reynard and those native to Greece and even India specifically. But fables involving the personification of animals can be found in disparate cultures around the globe, so it seems unlikely that the invention of the beast fable genre rests solely on the shoulders of a group of monks in Germany, though it is fairly indisputable that they played a very large role in popularizing one of the genre's most well-known characters. Reynard the Fox grew into a larger-than-life figure. It wasn't that there was a story or even a collection of stories, but many collections, written by many authors. The tales branched off into different discontinuous timelines, not unlike the various comic book universes that we are more familiar with today. What began as fables being written down, or at least copied down by priests and monks, was picked up by other storytellers, especially the court poets of France, which is probably how the name Reynard usurped the French gopil and became their default word for fox. France's poets, as far as we can tell, embellished and expanded upon the fables and possibly even further inspired German authors, though this is conjecture based on circumstantial evidence. But even with this uncertainty about the origins of these stories or characters, the names at least tell us who was writing them down. And it's interesting to think that even though the French Reynard and English fox, and therefore vixen, have completely separate etymologies, they both share this connection through Reynard. You see, vixen is of Germanic origin as well. It is closely descended from the Middle English vixen or foxen, which is taken from the Old English vixen, meaning female fox. And likewise, we have similar terms in Middle High German, Wuschin, and the modern German, Fuchsin, each with the same meaning. Fuchsin is born from the German Fuchs, a descendant of the Old High German Fuss, which comes from the proto-Germanic Fusses, meaning fox. This name appears to distinguish foxes from other animals by their distinctive white-tipped tails, as evidenced by the root word fuch, which is thought to be derived from the proto-indo-european root puk, meaning tail. The suffix n at the end of vixen unsurprisingly also owes its lineage to German, though its use in this instance is slightly more complex than it initially appears. In German, we see en or n tacked on to the ends of nouns in order to indicate plurality, yet vixen does not and has never been used grammatically to describe multiple foxes. Additionally, we see that same ending can be found on masculine nouns such as Regen, Boden, and Wagen. However, both of these forms are grammatically separate from the n at the end of vixen. Instead, the origins of this n ending is a bit more archaic and comes to us from the proto-Germanic suffix ini, which was usually added onto nouns in order to indicate that the subject being referenced is female, or specifically the female version of something, i.e. fox and vixen. The switchover from F to V, as it turns out, came down to dialect, with the southwest of England having a tendency to replace the former sound with the latter. But this connotation isn't by any stretch an anomaly. In terms of phonetics, these two letters, each functioning as phonemes, are both classified as labiodental fricatives. We initially touched on this concept briefly in our episode looking into the word fiasco, but we are going to do more of a deep dive here. A fricative, also known as a spirant, indicates a consonantal sound that is made by using parts of the mouth to restrict airflow without cutting it off completely. When air moves through this tight passage, it creates a kind of audible friction. There are multiple variations of these fricative sounds. The th sounds is a dental fricative, meaning that it is created between the teeth and tip of the tongue. S and Z sounds are both alveolar fricatives, produced when the tongue is lightly pressed against the alveolar ridge at the roof of the mouth towards the teeth. There are still other examples, but for our purposes, we will focus back on our labiodental fricatives F and V. Labiodental fricatives, as the name suggests, are made by touching the teeth to the lip, specifically the top teeth to the bottom lip, and forcing air out through the small gaps in this connection. Where the two sounds differ is that F is a voiceless fricative, meaning that the vocal folds are not used to create the F sound. Instead, the sound that we hear is strictly the sound of air pushing through the spaces between the teeth and lips. V, however, is a voiced fricative. We still get the sound of the air coming through, but we also hear the vibrations of the vocal folds as well. Being so similar, it is easy to see how speech, and especially casual speech, could lead to a transition between the two, and this is exactly how the Old English vixen evolved to our modern vixen. But vixen's definition has undergone a few evolutions as well. Master of Game was first published early on in the 15th century, when the term vixen referred to nothing more or less than a female fox. Yet the Elizabethan era saw the meaning expand. Vixen came to suggest an ill-tempered woman, sharp-tongued and shrewish. The Duke of York notes in his book that the vixen has a venomous bite, and it's interesting to think that perhaps this observation influenced how vixens were viewed culturally, although that idea is quite speculative. Regardless, the behavior of vixens seems to have had a significant impact on this new use of the word. Though even this usage is antiquated now, we can find it in classic literature. Likely the most famous use of vixen in this context comes from William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. In reference to the headstrong character of Hermia, it is written, "Oh, when she is angry, she is keen and shrewd. She was a vixen when she went to school, and though she be but little, she is fierce." This usage extended well into the 1900s, but by mid-century, vixen had begun to transform once again, and instead of referring to an ill-tempered shrew, It was now used to suggest the glamour and wiles of femininity, an evolution which seems to have been the result of female film characters who balanced seduction with more combative qualities, which is an interesting thought, as with our modern vixen, lovely and diverting, being so far removed from the creatures she was named after, it can be easy to forget that she has teeth. Thank you so much for listening. Please leave a like if you learned something, it really helps out the channel, and remember to subscribe and turn on notifications for more of these etymological deep dives.